Hello guys, I'm Arjun Meghdut, and in this video we will be discussing how to write our answers to question 3 and 6 of section A of IGCSE English Language B. Now, as I said in my previous video, I will be focusing a lot on section A because this is where you can lose a lot of your marks or gain a lot of your marks. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. Now, to write question 3 and 6, we follow what is called the PEE method, or what is called the point, example, and explain method. Now, what does it mean? Point, example, explain. To understand that, let's look at how normally questions 3 and 6 come in the exam. This is the Jan 22 paper, the paper I sat my exams in. So, let's look at question 3. It says, explain how the writer describes the Hotel du Lac. You should support your answer with close reference to the passage, including brief quotations. Question number 6 asks you, explain how the writer presents her expectations and experiences at the Hans Brinker Hotel. You should support your answer with close reference to the passage, including brief quotations. Now, as you can see, this part, you should support your answer, is common for both question 3 and 6. And another part is explain how the writer. Explain how the writer is common for question 3 and 6, and it is common for every paper of the recent syllabus of IGCSE English Language B. Question 3 and 6 are bound to ask you to explain how the writer does a certain thing, and that you should support your answer with close reference to the passage, including brief quotations. Remember when I said point, example, explain? See, it is all in the question. They first tell you to explain how the writer describes something or how the writer does something, and they say you should support your answer with close reference to the passage, including brief quotations. And this brief quotations part is basically our example part, where we have to give an example that this is what we're talking about in the passage. It will be more clear once we go in depth into the PEE method. But one thing you have to know right now is that the point portion equals to the technique the writer is using and writing that in our answer. So without further ado, let's learn some of the literary techniques and devices that a writer can use to write his text. Basically, the first thing you do when you get your IGCSE English Language B question paper is you start reading the text and you start marking techniques in the text, techniques that the writer has used in the text. And you do that for question 3 and 6 and question 7, but we'll come to that later. So how to mark the techniques? What are techniques? And today, that's all we're going to talk about. So let's learn some techniques that writers use to write their texts of section A. We can identify dozens of techniques in a text, but today I will be going through some of the big bosses of the technique department. First off is personification. Now, what is personification? It means to personify something, and by something I mean a non-human object. It means to give human attributes to something that is non-human, to give human attributes to animals, to inanimate objects like chairs and tables, and even to intangible emotions like fear, just like our example here. And the saddest fear comes creeping in. Fear cannot, come creeping in on us, but in this lyric it does, and this is a lyric of Taylor Swift. All of the examples I will be using to describe the techniques are going to be Taylor Swift lyrics unless I state otherwise. So by using, this comes creeping in, Taylor Swift has given a human attribute to fear, which is the technique of personification. Now, why do we use personification? It depends. It varies from text to text, but the general basic line of why we use personification is it makes the text more poetic and it makes the text more interesting. Next up is simile and metaphor. Now keep in mind these are two different techniques, but they're kind of similar, so I bunched them together right here. Now, what is a simile? A simile is basically a comparison between two things, and it is usually linked by the word like or the word as. While metaphor is also a comparison between two things, but this time you are saying that this one thing is the other thing, but in a literal sense, it is not. Let's look at our examples to make it a little bit more clear. Here, in our simile, the example is, we were like the mall before the internet. We were like. So it is again a comparison between two things. It's a comparison between we and the mall, but we are using the word like. We could also use the word as to compare two things, and that would also be a simile. Now, metaphor. Life was a willow and it bent right to your winds. See here how we are saying life was a willow. So it is a comparison between life and willow, and we are saying my life was a willow, but in a literal sense it is not. I hope it makes sense. The simile and metaphor, the difference between simile and metaphor is that, well, the similarity is that they're both comparing two things, while in simile the comparison is being linked together by the words as and like, whereas in metaphor the words are literally being compared to saying that this word is the other word. Next up is hyperbole or hyperbole, whatever you want to say. Now, hyperbole is basically excessive exaggeration, and it is used to prove a point. Like in our example here, Taylor Swift says, "I guess is the price I paid for 7 years in heaven." She's basically trying to say, I guess it's the price I paid for a good time. But instead of just saying, a good time or a marvelous time, she uses the words 7 years in heaven. This is excessive exaggeration. Sometimes we say, you're so tall, you're like 25 feet tall. Or, things like that. Excessive exaggeration is to prove a point. It's to prove that it was a really good time. For Taylor Swift, it was a really, really good time. 7 years in heaven. Or 25 feet tall. Like, he's really, really, really tall. Next up is alliteration. Alliteration is basically the repetition of the same consonant sounds in a line. Now, let's see the example. The example is, last the blood and bruise, past the curses and cries. Taylor Swift uses actually two alliterations in the same line, the blood and the bruise. The B is repeating here. B is a consonant and it's repeating, so it's alliteration. And past the curses and cries, the K sound. It's a consonant, therefore it is alliteration. Now, as a bonus, I'm going to be talking about another technique, and that is called sibilance. Sibilance, and it is when you repeat the S sound in a line or a verse. Like, it is just a special form of alliteration. Basically, in case of all other consonant, in case of all other repeating consonant, it's going to be alliteration. But whenever it is S, it becomes sibilance. For example, let's use your sister splashed out on the bottle. Your sister splashed out on the bottle. Here, sister splashed. The S sound is being repeated, so we can call it sibilance. Next up is assonance. And assonance is where a vowel sound gets repeated more than one time. So here, how's one to know? See, the O sound is being repeated in house, in one, in know. So we can consider it, we can classify it rather as assonance. And all these three techniques, assonance, alliteration, sibilance, all of these catches the reader's attention and makes the text feel more poetic. And this is the general description. It varies from every text and every time, techniques are used in a text. The next technique I will be talking about is oxymoron, and it is the last technique I will be talking about for today. Now, oxymoron is when you use contradictory words in one sentence. For example, I've never heard silence quite this loud. This is an oxymoron statement, which means the statement contradicts itself. Now, another part of oxymoron could be juxtaposition, which is another technique. Juxtaposition. In case of oxymoron, is just two contradictory words. Whenever you see two contradictory words in the same sentence, or in the same vicinity, you can call that technique oxymoron. But for a technique to be considered as juxtaposition, you need two contradictory ideas or elements. You need something bigger than just two words. Juxtaposition often represents a larger idea. That is when you can call a technique juxtaposition. I guess that's all for today. In the next video, we will talk more about the techniques that are left, and there are so many techniques. I think I will just, group some minor techniques together and just fast forward them without giving example, so we can, get through this technique learning process quickly. But these techniques are so important. You need to have them at, just at the forefront of your mind when you're reading the text. You cannot waste a second more trying to remember, wait, what was this technique called? That cannot happen. You have to absolutely grasp the techniques, with full force. And yeah, after we're done learning all of our techniques, we will just jump straight into how to structure your question 3 and 6, how to basically write the answers of question 3 and 6. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it. Until next time.